Right in the crowded airport lounge at Gate 42 of the Des Moines International Airport in Iowa, my own son casually snatched my first-class boarding pass for Seat 1A to give to his wife, lowering his voice with ruthless nonchalance to say, "Dad, just take a bus back home to the farm." I've reassigned this first-class seat to Celine. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or cause a scene. I simply clutched my old, scuffed canvas bag in absolute silence and walked away, choosing the humble comfort of the back row of hard blue plastic chairs. Little did Griffin know that the very moment he humiliated his father in front of hundreds of travelers, just 3 hours after standing over his mother Eleanor's fresh grave, a top-level security protocol was silently triggered within the private logistics empire I had built, preparing to bring the entire airport executive team rushing to the scene. This story starts quietly in the gray Iowa chill, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment for me right now. Have you ever been deeply underestimated or betrayed by someone closest to your heart? Yes or no? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. A quick note before we dive deeper. This story includes some fictionalized details to emphasize the underlying moral lesson, but what truly matters is the eternal message behind it. I stood at Gate 42 wearing heavy leather boots I had worn to Eleanor's funeral just 3 hours earlier, watching my 32-year-old son hand my first-class ticket to another woman, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of luggage he wished he could check into cargo. The boots were deeply scuffed at the toes, weathered by decades of hard Midwestern soil. Eleanor had bought them for me as a gift back in 1996, and I had resold them 4 times over the years to keep them walking. She used to look down at my feet and say with a gentle smile, "Buy new boots, Bernard." And I would always reply, "These still walk just fine, Ellie." And they did. Now those same scuffed boots were walking me toward a departure board that clearly displayed my name right next to Seat 1A, first class, destined non-stop for New York City. It was the exact flight Eleanor and I had carefully booked together 2 months ago, back when she was still strong enough to dream about visiting our successful son in Manhattan, before her illness took her final breath. Griffin Lancaster stood near the gate wearing a charcoal designer suit so sharp and tailored it could have cut glass. He held a hot artisanal coffee in one hand, and my expensive first-class boarding pass in the other, talking to his wife as if I weren't standing a mere 10 feet away, carrying the entirety of my earthly possessions in a weathered canvas duffel bag that smelled strongly of rich Iowa soil and memories. Celine Lancaster, 29, stood right beside him with the quiet, smug confidence of a corporate compliance consultant who had thoroughly vetted her wealthy father-in-law's personal finances before agreeing to the marriage. She had hired a private investigator to dig into my background, and the investigator had found exactly what she had paid him to find: a modest 40-acre farm and a meager $1,800 monthly Social Security check. "Dad," Griffin said, not even bothering to look me in the eye, his tone smooth and utterly devoid of filial respect. "The system just flagged an administrative error with your first-class ticket. I've gone ahead and reassigned that seat to Celine. She needs the comfort more than you do." I didn't answer him immediately. I just stood there, staring straight into his cold, calculating eyes. "You can easily wait for tomorrow morning's economy flight," Griffin continued smoothly, as if reading from a well-rehearsed corporate script. "It's just one more night, Dad. The old farm isn't going anywhere, and nobody is going to steal your tractor." I looked down at the heavy platinum and titanium ring resting securely on my left ring finger. It was Eleanor's precious gift to me on our 10th wedding anniversary. She had told me back then with fierce devotion, "Never take it off, Bernard. Even when your hands are caked in grease and dirt." I never had. Griffin's voice took on a sharper edge now, betraying a deep, impatient irritation that he could no longer mask. I slowly looked up from my ring, glanced at the flickering departure board overhead, looked right back at my ungrateful son, and remained entirely silent. Griffin hadn't even bothered to attend his own mother's funeral. He had called me that very morning with a convenient, rehearsed excuse about an unmovable, critical corporate business meeting in the city. I knew for a fact that the meeting never existed, but I had said nothing over the phone. I had simply listened to my only son lie to me while I stood alone in our quiet kitchen with my morning coffee turning stone cold, with Eleanor's physical body barely tucked beneath the cold earth. And now here he stood at the airport gate, not to mourn his mother, not to comfort his grieving father, but to steal my seat and push me out of his polished life. Without uttering a single word of protest, I turned my back on them, walked all the way to the very last row of blue plastic chairs in the terminal, and sat down heavily. I carefully set my canvas bag at my feet, feeling the exhaustion of the past week pressed down on my shoulders. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in the freezing wind over Eleanor's grave and promised her I would remain strong through whatever storm came next. I didn't know at the time that she had already engineered my strength to be far greater than anyone in this crowded terminal could possibly perceive. Just as I settled into the hard plastic seat, a sharp, practiced, and remarkably obnoxious woman's voice cut straight through the ambient airport noise. "Well, would you just look at this spectacle?" Marlene Whitfield, a 64-year-old corporate CEO of Miller Industrial Supplies, positioned herself aggressively about 8 feet back from where I sat alone. I watched out of the corner of my eye as she raised her expensive iPhone, holding it vertically, and her manicured thumb tapped rapidly against the glass screen. The little red recording light blinked on, signaling a live broadcast. TikTok Live. She deliberately angled her high-definition camera directly toward me, and I caught my own reflection in the grease-streaked terminal window behind her. An old man in a worn canvas coat, scuffed boots, and a cheap canvas duffel bag sitting miserably between my feet. It was precisely the pathetic, impoverished image she wanted to project to the digital world. "Look at this, everyone," she cooed loudly to her growing online audience, her voice dripping with dripping venom disguised as false pity. "It's my dear friend's country father-in-law, stranded right here at the gate, stubbornly refusing to take a cheap bus home like any sensible person would suggest." Hearing his cue, Griffin smoothly stepped directly into the camera's wide frame, his gourmet coffee still clutched in his hand. "Dad," he projected loudly, pitching his voice just enough so the phone's built-in microphone could catch every single calculated word for his social media validation. "Just go buy a Greyhound ticket. A grueling 32-hour bus ride back to Iowa will do your stubborn soul some good." I still didn't turn my head, keeping my gaze fixed forward. My left hand rested gently and protectively over the wedding band Eleanor had given me decades ago. All around us, passing passengers began noticing the public spectacle. Some looked away instantly, deeply embarrassed by the blatant cruelty unfolding before them, while others shamelessly pulled out their own smartphones to record the humiliation of an old man. That is the dark, insidious thing about public cruelty in modern society. It works so effectively simply because everyone in the crowd blindly assumes someone braver will step forward to speak up, yet absolutely no one ever does. Marlene kept filming relentlessly, adjusting her lighting, completely unaware of the ticking time bomb she had just activated. I could clearly see the viewer count climbing upward on her glowing screen. 300, 500, 1,000 live viewers tuning in to watch an old man get dragged for entertainment. She had no earthly idea who was actually watching across the digital landscape. Let me tell you a fundamental truth about modern technology and power. When you film a man's engineered humiliation and broadcast it live to the entire world, sometimes the world already knows his exact name, his net worth, and how easily he can crush your entire existence with a single phone call. In the ultra-exclusive corporate business lounge located just 200 meters away across the concourse, 14 senior bank executives were casually scrolling through their smartphones during a delayed layover, accompanied by 3 venture capital directors and a senior Wall Street Journal reporter nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. Suddenly, Marlene's toxic livestream popped up directly on their social media feeds, already pulling in over 3,000 concurrent viewers within the first 6 minutes. But buried deep within those 3,000 viewers were the exact people who truly mattered in the corporate hierarchy. An observant investor relations officer from Wells Fargo instantly recognized the elderly man in the worn canvas coat not as some embarrassing Midwestern farmer, but as Bernard Lancaster, the legendary reclusive founder of Ellison Regional Holdings. The titan who had quietly engineered and built a multi-billion-dollar logistics and freight empire, while the rest of the oblivious world casually assumed he was just another dirt-poor farmer from rural Iowa. Simultaneously, another high-ranking executive from U.S. Bank froze mid-sip over his coffee. The screen displayed Marlene Whitfield's corporate identity. Miller Industrial Supplies, Marlene's failing company, currently owed his bank a staggering $180 million revolving credit line. And the arrogant woman currently mocking Bernard Lancaster live on TikTok had absolutely no clue that the quiet, battered old man she was broadcasting to the masses actually owned the very commercial airline she was standing inside. Marlene adjusted her camera angle once more, flashing a brilliant, triumphant smile at her phone screen as her live stream crossed the 9-minute mark. Then, abruptly, her phone violently vibrated in her hand. I couldn't hear the specifics of the incoming phone call across the distance, but I didn't need to. I watched her smug face instantly drain of all color, watched her eyes go wide with absolute terror, and watched her thumb fumble frantically to end the live broadcast as the incoming caller ID flashed clear enough across her glowing screen for me to read from 10 feet away. Her own chief financial officer at Miller Industrial Supplies, calling with code red panic. Right behind me in the terminal, I heard the rapid, sharp click of expensive leather shoes striking the hard airport tile. Not just one pair, but 3, then 5, moving with purposeful urgency. The ambient background noise of the massive terminal seemed to drop by half in an instant, as if the entire physical space had suddenly taken a collective breath and held it in suspended animation. I didn't turn around to look. I already knew precisely who was coming down that concourse. The urgent footsteps echoing behind me could easily wait. After all, they had been waiting a lifetime for this exact reckoning. Sitting alone on the hard blue plastic chair in the crowded terminal of Des Moines International Airport, while the muffled echoes of Marlene's panicked phone call faded into the distance, my mind drifted far away from the glaring fluorescent lights and the hurried footsteps of passing travelers. The cold metal of the chair beneath me seemed to dissolve, replaced instantly by another kind of chill, the bitter, biting frost of Juneau, Alaska, in the dead of winter in 1977. I was only 20 years old back then when I stepped down from a dusty Greyhound bus, with barely $200 cash stuffed into my pocket and every single earthly possession I owned crammed into a cheap canvas duffel bag that smelled of diesel fuel and desperate decisions. The Alaskan air hit my lungs like a physical punch, registering at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of deep, unforgiving cold that makes breathing itself feel like a sharp ache in your chest. The local sawmill sat right at the ragged edge of town, past the final flickering street lamp, where the paved road abruptly turned to frozen gravel and human hope grew paper-thin. Thick plumes of dark wood smoke poured relentlessly from a corrugated metal chimney, and even from the desolate parking lot I could hear the high-pitched, terrifying scream of massive industrial saws biting savagely through frozen timber. The mill owner met me at the heavy wooden loading door, a weathered man with a thick gray beard, hands like hardened leather, and eyes that had undoubtedly witnessed 1,000 desperate young men walk through that snowstorm looking for a lifeline. "You got any mill experience, kid?" he had barked at me over the deafening roar of the machinery. "No, sir," I answered honestly. "You willing to work the graveyard shift in this freezing hell?" I looked back at the owner, looked down at the $200 that was supposed to sustain me for an entire month, and looked up at the crooked wooden sign nailed to the wall that read night shift hiring. Every single fiber of my being answered without hesitation. "I'll take it, all of it." He hired me on the spot, not because I was qualified or skilled, but simply because I was young, exhausted, and desperately willing to do the brutal work no one else wanted to touch. For 3 long years, that was my entire universe, loading heavy timber in -20-degree weather, with hands so completely frozen I couldn't feel my fingers by the 3rd hour of the shift, learning intimately how cargo moved from point A to point B. While the other weary men merely lifted, loaded, and dragged themselves home to sleep, I spent my quiet breaks hunched over a sputtering kerosene lamp in the drafty break room, sketching complex freight routes on scraps of wood wrapping paper, on the backs of shipping manifests, and on anything dry I could salvage. I charted the invisible paths from mill to port, from port to buyer, and from buyer to builder, designing the unseen circulatory system that made the entire lumber trade function. Somewhere during those 3 frozen years in Alaska, I finally understood a profound truth the other men never grasped. Cargo never moves itself. Someone has to design the path it takes. Someone has to see the entire macro system when everyone else is simply blinded by the next heavy load. That was where I first learned that absolute silence can be a devastating form of power, that watching, listening, and thinking cost nothing except patience, and patience is the single currency most arrogant people flatly refuse to spend. Eleanor, the remarkable woman who would pass away just 3 weeks before that fateful afternoon at Gate 42, met me when I was 28. Back when I owned 3 battered freight contracts and a rusty, sputtering truck. She took one look at that beat-up truck, looked straight into my eyes with her fierce, discerning gaze, and said simply, "You're going to need a lot more trucks, Bernard." That was her unique, beautiful way of telling me she loved me. From that frozen Alaskan sawmill all the way to a $2.8 billion global logistics empire, Eleanor was the bedrock of my existence. Yet my biological son, Griffin, had only ever seen my scuffed, resoled boots, never once pausing to ask where those boots had actually walked or what fires they had survived. Sitting back in the present terminal chair, surrounded by the ordinary hum of modern life, a sudden, chilling realization sliced through my thoughts, tethering the past directly to the darkest manipulations of the present. I pulled my smartphone from my heavy winter coat pocket, tapping the screen to bring up the custom interface of an application called Family Sync, a digital tool Griffin had aggressively insisted on installing on my phone 3 years ago, under the guise of helping his aging father manage complex travel schedules and stay connected. He had framed it as an act of filial devotion, telling me it would make life easier for an old man who supposedly didn't understand modern technology. Of course, having built a multi-billion-dollar global logistics infrastructure, I understood digital architecture and data protocols quite well. I understood technology down to its core binary logic, but I had deliberately allowed him to install it, not because I needed assistance booking flights, but simply because I wanted to observe what my ambitious, ungrateful son would do when handed even a microscopic sliver of perceived power and administrative control over my daily movements. For 3 long years, I watched him quietly utilize that app to monitor my remote whereabouts, to precisely track when I would be physically absent from the Iowa farm, and to meticulously coordinate his rare obligatory holiday visits precisely around my absence, showing up only when I wasn't there so he could interrogate Felix for favors he was too proud to ask me for directly. It had always been deeply convenient for him, but utterly revealing for me. Yet, as I stared at the active background permissions running within the application settings on my screen today, the cold truth expanded far beyond mere schedule coordination. Hidden deep within the subroutines of the Family Sync app, Griffin had quietly woven administrative tracking hooks linked directly to my personal digital banking credentials and my secondary corporate portal assets, the exact credentials tied to my primary Ellison Holdings executive profile. He had not merely designed a calendar app to check when the old man was out of town. He had engineered a digital surveillance and extraction tool intended to monitor my financial liquidity, map my estate holdings, and locate the precise digital keys needed to execute his corporate takeover the moment I breathed my last breath. The app was a Trojan horse, constructed with modern code and Silicon Valley polish, designed by a son who viewed his own father not as a human being, but as a stubborn obstacle blocking his inheritance. Every ping, every location check, every automated itinerary sync was a calculated data point in his grand scheme to accelerate my obsolescence. The realization did not provoke rage within me. Rather, it settled over my chest with a heavy, icy clarity, confirming every dark suspicion Eleanor and I had whispered about over our kitchen table in the quiet hours of the night. My son had not merely grown emotionally distant or financially reckless. He had weaponized modern software to orchestrate a digital ambush against the man who had funded his entire existence. He had calculated my life, my travels, and my impending demise through algorithms and administrative permissions, utterly blind to the reality that the very system he sought to exploit was built by a man who had mastered the invisible pathways of the world decades before Silicon Valley even existed. As I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, the departure board flickered above, and I felt the cold, unyielding resolve of the Alaskan wilderness settle deep into my bones once more. Griffin had built a digital cage with the arrogant confidence of a man who thought he had outsmarted the architect, completely unaware that he had merely locked himself inside an airtight vault of his own compounding design, while I sat quietly on the blue plastic chair in the terminal, letting the cold reality of Griffin's digital manipulations sink deep into my bones. My cell phone vibrated silently against my thigh, cutting through the ambient noise of the airport. The screen illuminated with the incoming caller ID of James Hartley, the sharp, silver-haired attorney who had served as my legal counsel and trusted confidant for over 22 years. James was the kind of meticulous lawyer who read legal contracts the way other men read the morning weather report, not merely for what the plain text explicitly stated, but for what those clauses were quietly engineered to achieve 3 or 5 steps down the line. I slid my thumb across the screen, brought the phone to my ear, and answered in a low, steady voice. "Bernard," James began without any preamble or polite pleasantries, his tone carrying the precise professional edge of a man delivering urgent news from the front lines of corporate defense. Celine's private legal counsel just filed additional discovery documents over in the civil division related to their pending family estate registry. I need you to pull up page 47 of the prenuptial agreement Griffin and Celine signed right before their wedding, and I need you to look at it very closely. A faint, cold smile touched the corners of my mouth, because I already knew precisely what was written on that specific page. Eleanor and I had sat together at our old wooden kitchen table back in 2020, 4 years before her passing, scrutinizing every single paragraph of that document when Griffin had first brought Celine home to introduce her to the family. Eleanor had studied Celine with the exact same clinical, unblinking intensity she used to evaluate complex shipping and logistics contracts decades ago, looking far beyond what was grandly presented on the surface to search relentlessly for what was being hidden underneath. Page 47 contained a carefully buried Delaware corporate dissolution clause, masterfully drafted legal language that was standard enough to easily slip past an untrained eye, yet devastatingly lethal if triggered. The clause stipulated that if Lancaster Holdings, the family's primary public-facing corporate entity, should ever dissolve, face technical bankruptcy, or enter into forced restructuring, the prenuptial agreement's standard asset protection barriers would instantly nullify, entitling Celine to a staggering 50% share of all personal and corporate assets acquired during the marriage. I already know what is on page 47, James, I replied calmly into the phone, leaning my head back against the hard wall of the airport terminal. Eleanor and I reviewed it line by line years ago when they first got engaged. Then you know the timing of their legal maneuvers isn't mere coincidence. It's an architectural trap, James warned, his voice dropping an octave with grave concern. Celine isn't just going after a routine divorce settlement or standard alimony, Bernard. She is systematically executing a premeditated corporate raid. If she can legally manipulate the courts into forcing Lancaster Holdings into a technical dissolution or a fabricated bankruptcy, she walks away with half of everything your family name controls. She can try all she wants, James, I said softly, letting out a measured breath. Celine can draft 100 predatory clauses, but she will ultimately find herself entirely empty-handed because Lancaster Holdings doesn't hold anything worth taking. Everything Eleanor and I spent a lifetime building is securely housed inside the Ellison Infrastructure Trust, named entirely after her maiden name, Ellison, maintaining zero public or legal connection to the Lancaster family name. Lancaster Holdings has been an empty, hollow corporate shell since 2014. A heavy, stunned silence hung over the phone line for several long seconds, followed by the sound of James exhaling slowly, the unmistakable sound of a veteran attorney rapidly recalculating the entire chessboard in his head. "The trust is completely sealed?" James asked, checking for absolute legal airtightness. Eleanor signed it herself? She signed every single page herself in 2014 while sitting in her hospital room, I confirmed, remembering the quiet dignity of my wife's final arrangements. It has no public connection to Griffin, no connection to any assets Celine's private investigator could have possibly dug up when they paid him to vet my finances before the wedding, and no vulnerability to corporate dissolution. James let out a low whistle of profound professional admiration through the speaker. So the trap they laid on page 47 catches absolutely nothing. I finished for him with grim satisfaction. Let her spring it. Let Griffin think their master plan is working seamlessly. Let them both blissfully believe they have outsmarted the old man and successfully cornered the family fortune. The most dangerous, devastating thing you can ever do to a person who has spent their entire life underestimating you is to simply step aside, stay completely silent, and let them keep running headfirst into their own engineered illusion. As I ended the call with James Hartley and slipped my phone back into my pocket, my mind drifted backward across the passage of time, illuminating the profound wisdom behind Eleanor's masterclass in legacy protection. Sitting in that sterile hospital room a decade prior, while the steady beep of the heart monitor marked the final ebbing sands of her life, Eleanor had looked past our biological son, whose heart had already grown cold and transactional, to choose a far superior path of human stewardship. That was the exact moment when the true story of our successor, Felix Kendrick, officially began. Griffin had always arrogantly assumed he was the undisputed center of our universe, entitled by bloodline alone to inherit a multi-billion-dollar empire without ever having to sweat, bleed, or learn the quiet humility of true labor. Yet, in stark contrast, Felix Kendrick had entered our lives not through the comfortable privilege of a hospital delivery room, but through the harsh, unforgiving crucible of the foster care system. In the autumn of 2016, Eleanor had organized a regional charity drive at the local community center in Des Moines, tirelessly raising vital funds for teenagers who had aged out of state care with nowhere to turn and zero safety nets. That was where we first crossed paths with 18-year-old Felix. He wore a donated, oversized suit that hung loosely from his frame, but his handshake possessed a fierce, unshakable firmness that instantly communicated the rare difference between superficial performance and genuine human respect. While the other volunteers complained about the heavy lifting, Felix quietly spent 12 hours straight carrying folding tables, setting up chairs, and politely thanking every single donor by name, having memorized their names the very first time he heard them. I vividly recalled Eleanor leaning over to me during the crowded evening reception, her sharp eyes glistening with sudden emotional clarity as she watched Felix patiently console a crying child whose family registration papers had been misplaced. She had whispered 4 simple, prophetic words directly into my ear that I would carry like a sacred oath for the rest of my days. "He is the one, Bernard." Over the next 8 years, we brought Felix into our inner circle quietly, initially hiring him to handle basic manual labor around the Iowa farm to test his work ethic. But Eleanor took him under her direct wing, teaching him the complex architecture of supply chain logistics, while I personally schooled him in reading dense freight contracts, identifying structural inefficiencies in regional shipping lanes, and understanding how to read the invisible macroscopic systems that safely move goods across the continent. Felix was never a flashy prodigy or an arrogant genius. He possessed something infinitely rarer and more valuable in this broken world, an unyielding integrity that remained entirely steady and uncorrupted when absolutely no one was watching. He was the kind of honest young man who, if you handed him a single-dollar bill and instructed him to hold it safely for 3 years, would return that exact same crisp dollar bill to your hand without ever once entertaining the selfish notion that a fraction of it could secretly belong to him. Yet, as the bitter irony of human blindness would have it, while Felix was quietly mastering the foundational pillars of our family's life's work at our kitchen table, my own biological son, Griffin, was treating that exact same farmhouse with supreme disdain and arrogant neglect. Over those same 8 years, Griffin had driven out to visit our farm exactly 3 times. On 2 of those rare, obligatory visits, he hadn't come to check on his aging mother's deteriorating health or share a peaceful family meal. He had driven out solely to demand financial bailouts, unashamedly asking for cash infusions to feed his escalating lifestyle. And in a display of supreme blinding narcissism, every single time Griffin walked through our kitchen door, he had to physically step past the framed photograph of Felix standing proudly beside Eleanor and me that hung right beside the wooden table where every major family decision had been forged for 3 decades. Tragically, Griffin had walked past that framed photograph a total of 3 separate times in 8 years. Yet he had never once possessed enough baseline curiosity, filial affection, or basic human respect to pause, point his finger toward the image, and ask the only question that truly mattered. Dad, who is this young man sharing our home? He had been entirely too consumed by his own reflection, his social status, and his frantic pursuit of corporate validation to ever notice the quiet, profound reality unfolding right beneath his ungrateful nose. His blind, arrogant assumption that the world owed him everything had effectively blinded him to the very person who had actually earned the right to carry our legacy forward. Sitting there in the airport terminal, waiting for the ticking time bomb of his own making to fully detonate, I realized that Griffin's ultimate tragedy wasn't merely that he had lost his inheritance. It was that his terminal selfishness had rendered him utterly incapable of recognizing true character even when it was framed and hanging on his own family's kitchen wall. While the tension at Gate 42 continued to simmer in the background, a sudden, innocent break in the atmosphere pierced through the heavy air like a clear bell ringing in a dense fog. 3 rows behind where I sat alone on the hard blue plastic chair, a 6-year-old boy with wide, honest eyes looked up from his coloring book, tugged gently on his father's sleeve, and asked in a small, crystal-clear voice that carried effortlessly across the silent seating area, "Daddy, why is that grandpa in the scuffed boots sitting all alone while everyone is being mean to him?" The boy's father immediately panicked, his face flushing crimson with embarrassment, and hushed him frantically, whispering, "Shh, buddy, don't look, that's none of our business." But the damage, or rather the divine intervention, had already been done. That innocent, unedited question from a child who possessed more basic human empathy than anyone else in the terminal cut straight through 47 minutes of my self-imposed silence. It acted as an unexpected permission slip from the universe, reminding me that the time for quiet endurance had officially expired, and the time for absolute accountability had arrived. I looked down one final time at the scuffed leather toes of my resoled boots. Boots that had walked through the freezing timber mills of Alaska and across the sacred ground of Eleanor's grave, and I made my quiet decision. I slowly stood up from the blue plastic chair, gripped the handle of my worn canvas bag that smelled faintly of Iowa soil, and began walking with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who was no longer hiding in the background. I bypassed the crowded boarding lane where Griffin and Celine stood chatting smugly, and walked directly toward the exclusive VIP services desk located just 50 feet away. Behind the counter, a young 28-year-old desk agent named Hayes Travers looked up with his professionally rehearsed corporate smile, expecting another minor customer complaint about a delayed bag or a seating change. Instead, I walked right up to the polished mahogany surface, placed my right hand deliberately flat upon the desk, just 3 inches away from the integrated near-field communication scanner, and positioned my left hand so that the platinum and titanium wedding ring Eleanor had given me caught the harsh fluorescent overhead light. Without tapping the glass scanner aggressively, I simply held my hand there with absolute stillness and spoke my first words in nearly an hour, my voice remaining completely calm, level, and steady. "Run my executive profile through the system, please," I said quietly. Hayes blinked in momentary surprise, his retail training kicking in as he activated his greeting interface. "Of course, sir." "May I please have your full legal name?" "Bernard Lancaster," I replied. I watched his fingers move smoothly across the mechanical keyboard, typing my name once under standard passenger parameters. Then his fingers suddenly froze. He paused, hit the backspace key several times, and typed my name again much slower, far more carefully, as if assuming he had made a typographical error. But he hadn't made any mistake at all. In an instant, The standard customer service interface on his primary terminal screen flashed violently white and then completely froze for 2 full seconds. When the system finally resolved, the ordinary consumer flight booking screen was completely gone, replaced instead by a deep, secure navy blue executive profile screen bearing the unmistakable golden crest of Apex Airlines in the upper right-hand corner. Directly beneath the crest, a security alert flashed in angry, pulsating red letters. Secutive level account, attest by ungressord secondture. Hayes's face instantly drained of all color, going completely rigid. It wasn't just the face of a man experiencing ordinary shock. It was the paralyzed expression a person gets when their brain processes data vastly faster than their physical facial muscles can possibly react. Without breaking his terrified eye contact with the navy blue screen, his hand moved automatically toward the internal landline phone on his desk, his voice suddenly dropping an entire octave in pitch. "I need the station supervisor at the VIP desk immediately," he whispered frantically into the receiver, his fingers trembling against the desk. "We have an executive-level profile trigger with an active security flag. Let me tell you about the exact second real power finally reveals itself in this world. It is never loud, it is never theatrical, and it never requires a speech. Real power is a high-tech computer terminal freezing on a secret Navy interface that ordinary employees are never supposed to lay eyes on. Real power is a young man's voice dropping an octave as he calls for emergency backup because he realizes the old man standing in front of him in resoled boots actually owns the entire global carrier. Before Hayes could even hang up the landline phone, the ambient noise of the concourse was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of fast leather shoes striking the polished terminal floor. Not just one pair of shoes, but 3 pairs, then 5, moving with terrifying speed and athletic urgency. People were sprinting down the concourse while desperately trying not to look like they were running, attempting frantically not to cause a public panic. Brenda Owens, the station supervisor, was the first link in the high-speed chain reaction, having sprinted from the administrative offices the moment Hayes's call hit her console. Following right behind her was station manager Carl Jennings, who instantly understood the catastrophic implications of an Apex executive flag and immediately executed an internal system command, locking out and erasing Griffin and Celine's boarding passes from the global inventory in less than 4 seconds. And finally, leading the charge at full sprint while desperately adjusting his crooked tie on the run, came Richard Holt, the 52-year-old airport director of Des Moines International Airport, who had served in his administrative post for 11 long years, long enough to recognize an Apex Holdings master executive override flash on a remote monitor and sprint down 300 yards of terminal carpet because the sole owner of the airline was sitting in a VIP chair wearing scuffed boots. Director Holt skidded to a halt right in front of the VIP desk, his polished leather shoes squeaking against the tile, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Without a second's hesitation, he straightened his posture, looked directly at me, and executed a deep, flawless 90-degree bow that brought his upper body parallel to the floor. "Mr. Lancaster, sir." Richard Holt's voice carried clearly across the entirely silent, paralyzed concourse ringing off the metal rafters. "I am deeply, profoundly sorry. We had absolutely no idea you were traveling through our facility tonight. Whatever you need, anything at all in this entire terminal, consider it instantly done." Across the concourse at Gate 42, the 300 passengers who had been casually waiting to board their flights froze completely in their tracks, turning their heads in unison to stare at the airport director bowing deeply to an old man with a canvas bag. Marlene Whitfield, the arrogant CEO of Miller Industrial Supplies, stood frozen in absolute horror just 15 feet away, her expensive iPhone still clutched in her hand, her TikTok live stream still active but entirely forgotten as her jaw dropped open in sheer disbelief. And standing right beside the jet bridge, Griffin and Celine watched the unfolding spectacle with their blood completely draining from their faces. The smug, arrogant smirks that had adorned their lips just moments ago flickered, collapsed, and died entirely as their brains struggled to process what a 90-degree bow from the highest-ranking airport official actually meant. They didn't fully comprehend the vast scale of the architecture yet, but they were starting to realize that the silent old man they had humiliated and discarded was somehow the absolute master of the entire domain. Before Marlene could even recover enough motor function to lift her phone back up, 2 federal airport security police officers, seasoned veterans of high-security transport zones who recognized a direct threat to civil aviation order, marched swiftly across the open tile and flanked her on both sides. "Ma'am," the lead officer commanded in a low, steely voice that brooked zero argument, "you are actively filming, harassing passengers, and creating a dangerous public disturbance in an active secured boarding zone. Turn off that live broadcast and step back away from this desk immediately." or I will forcibly escort you out of this facility under federal disorderly conduct regulations." Marlene's face went from pale to ghostly white. She stammered uselessly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, desperately trying to invoke her corporate status as a CEO. But the officer merely extended his hand toward her screen. Reluctantly, with trembling fingers, Marlene tapped her phone display to finally kill the humiliating live broadcast and lowered her expensive device down to her side, utterly destroyed, publicly stripped of her digital armor, and facing complete professional ruin as the thousands of viewers online watched her stream abruptly cut to black. Director Holt straightened up from his deep bow, remaining at rigid attention, and dropped his voice to a respectful whisper. "Sir, shall I have those disruptive individuals escorted from the terminal by armed security right now?" I looked past the director, casting my gaze across the wide-open concourse toward Gate 42, where my ungrateful son stood staring like a ghost. I knew with absolute mathematical certainty that Carl Jennings had already purged their names from the database, meaning their first-class seats were gone, their standby options were zero, and their credit cards were flagged across the entire carrier network. They were completely locked out. "No, Richard," I answered quietly, my voice carrying an ironclad calm that could be heard across the entire check-in area. "Let them attempt to board their flight, if there are actually any valid seats left." 3 days after I walked past my son and his bewildered wife at Gate 42 in Des Moines, leaving them stranded in an airport terminal that suddenly belonged to a ghost they had spent years dismissing, I sat in the quiet, wood-paneled law office of James Hartley in downtown Manhattan. The morning light filtered gently through clean windows that overlooked calm, ordinary city streets where pedestrians walked their dogs, bought morning newspapers, and carried on with their daily routines, completely oblivious to the fact that 72 hours prior, a quiet father had stood up from an airport chair and casually triggered the absolute destruction of his son's entire career and social standing. The mahogany office smelled richly of dark oak, old leather, and black coffee, a timeless space where nothing overly dramatic ever seemed to happen on the surface. Yet the single piece of white legal paper James placed directly in front of me carried the weight of a quiet avalanche. The document was 3 pages long, written in dense, flawless legibility, but I only needed to turn to the final page to complete my task. This instrument formally and irrevocably refuses any extension of the $45 million revolving corporate bond package held by Miller Industrial Supplies under your primary creditor designation, Bernard, James stated, his voice steady, professional, and entirely unhesitating. "It is your absolute legal right as primary holder. Those bonds mature in exactly 8 days. Without your signature to authorize the rollover extension, Miller Industrial faces immediate default." I picked up a heavy fountain pen, feeling its balanced weight in my hand. James leaned forward slightly, watching me with a mixture of professional awe and deep personal respect. "Once the primary banking syndicates see you pull your capital out, they will independently revoke all subsidiary credit lines within 48 hours. The entire financial architecture Marlene and Celine built will violently collapse. Are you completely certain about this, Bernard?" I looked up from the paper and met his gaze. James had known Eleanor for decades. He had drafted her original will, personally witnessed her signing the binding documents, and had even sat quietly in her hospital room at 2 o'clock in the morning when she asked him to notarize her final, unshakable wishes. "Eleanor was entirely certain 10 years ago when she designed this framework, James," I said quietly, my voice calm and resolute. "I am merely putting my signature on the line to let gravity do what gravity does best." I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name in one clean, unbroken stroke. There are fundamentally 2 distinct kinds of power in this chaotic world. The loud, obnoxious kind that shouts, threatens, and desperately demands public attention, and the quiet kind that simply signs its name to a single piece of paper, sets down the pen, and calmly goes home to feed the chickens while an entire corporate empire crumbles 70 miles away. I drove straight back to the Iowa farm that afternoon, fed the chickens in the crisp autumn air, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat out on the wooden porch to watch the November clouds drift lazily across the vast agricultural fields that had belonged to my family for 3 consecutive generations. The next afternoon, at precisely 4 o'clock, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden table. Miller Industrial had just officially filed emergency corporate restructuring papers with the federal bankruptcy court, James announced without preamble over the speaker. The secondary bank syndicates had aggressively pulled every remaining credit line, and Griffin's personal guarantees as a corporate guarantor were being instantly called in by ruthless liquidators. It was completely over. "Thank you, James," I said softly, before hanging up the phone and heading back outside to feed the chickens once more, not out of cold indifference, but out of a profound sense of natural completion. What had to happen had finally transpired. The rest was merely the inevitable pull of gravity. That evening, as the vibrant autumn sun dipped low below the dark silhouette of the old red barn and the Iowa sky turned that breathtaking, fiery shade of orange Eleanor used to say looked like God was painting with liquid fire, my phone hummed again. Griffin's name flashed across the digital screen. I pressed the answer button. Dad? His voice sounded completely unrecognizable. The arrogant corporate confidence entirely stripped away, replaced by something raw, frantic, and desperate. My company, Miller Industrial, is freezing all accounts. Everything is collapsing around me. You have to fix this, Dad. You're the only one with the power to restructure the bonds. I let him talk. I let him exhaust every single manufactured excuse, every elaborate explanation, every desperate calculation about how none of this was his fault, how Celine had misled him, how Marlene Miller had forced his hand, and how the timing of the market crash was merely an unfortunate coincidence. Do you want to hear what your mother actually had to say about all of this before she passed? I interrupted quietly, cutting through his panicked rambling. A long, agonizing silence hung over the phone line. Without waiting for his permission, I pressed play on a digital video file stored securely on my device, holding the phone's speaker close to my ear. Eleanor's clear, steady voice echoed softly into the falling Iowa twilight, beautiful and final. Griffin, if you're watching this video, it means you chose to abandon your father immediately after my funeral. I prayed to God every single night that you would prove me wrong and choose a different path. I was wrong. I love you, Griffin. I will always love you. But I cannot hand a lifelong family legacy to a man who has never learned that family is not a corporate asset you manage like a stock portfolio. I officially struck your name from the trust last month. Your father knows the truth. Felix knows the truth. Now you know it too. 40 full seconds of absolute, suffocating silence stretched across the phone line. I could hear Griffin's ragged, uneven breathing on the other end. When did Mom record that video? He asked finally, his voice reduced to a trembling, broken whisper. Back in October, I replied. 3 weeks before she lost her battle. Another heavy pause followed. I didn't know, Griffin whispered hoarsely. I honestly didn't know. I hadn't played that video out of petty malice or spite. I played it because Eleanor had earned the absolute right to speak her truth, and because some foundational realities are simply too heavy for a living father to carry all alone when the woman who bore them is gone. We stayed connected on that call for another full minute in unbroken silence before Griffin blindly disconnected without even saying goodbye. The following morning, the internal airline blacklist and corporate security flags did precisely what I knew they would do. Griffin and Celine found themselves utterly stranded in Manhattan, completely unable to board their original carrier, while secondary commercial airlines instantly rejected their frozen credit cards as creditors rapidly smelled blood in the turbulent corporate water. Celine frantically opened her luxury designer wallet, counting out the last remaining cash reserves. $340 in physical bills, while everything else she owned was legally locked, frozen, and flagged by federal investigators. Out of absolute desperation, they hailed a yellow cab and directed the driver to the chaotic, crowded Port Authority bus terminal in the heart of Manhattan. The ticket agent behind the reinforced glass processed 2 one-way Greyhound bus tickets bound for rural Iowa with the practiced, soul-crushed indifference of a man who had witnessed 1,000 desperate souls buying last-minute escape routes and knew better than to ask probing questions. 2 one-way tickets to Waterloo, Iowa, Celine stated flatly, her voice devoid of its usual piercing authority. The agent typed rapidly without looking up. That will be 32 hours of continuous transit with 4 transfers. Total is $168. Celine wordlessly handed over the crumpled cash from her wallet. Griffin silently sank into the hard, uncomfortable plastic seat of the Greyhound bus at 10:40 in the morning on November 19, 2024. The seat did not recline even a fraction of an inch. The thin synthetic padding offered zero lower back support, and the bus window was deeply scratched and clouded from years of weary travelers staring blankly out at interstate highways they never wanted to traverse. It was the exact grueling route configuration Griffin had arrogantly instructed me to take just 5 days earlier. Celine sat right beside him in absolute, stony silence. Not a peaceful silence, but a toxic, calculating silence where the cold math of her carefully engineered life suddenly showed zero margin, 0 remaining options, and 0 moves left on the board. I knew that exact bus route intimately by heart, having ridden that very same cross-country line back in 1981 when returning home from Alaska to consult an old friend before securing my very first major commercial freight contract. I hadn't possessed airplane money back then either. I had sat in that exact same uncomfortable plastic seat sketching complex logistics routes in a worn-out notebook for 32 straight hours, forcing myself to see the invisible economic pathways that move the entire world. And now, my 32-year-old son sat trapped in that exact same seat, forced to stare out the window and finally confront the bitter, undeniable reality of what it means to have absolutely nothing left in the world except the unforgiving road stretching out ahead of you and the devastating choices piling up behind you. Yet, before Griffin even completed his miserable 32-hour bus journey back to Iowa, an even more profound shock awaited him upon arrival. Before leaving the Manhattan terminal, as Celine sat beside him staring blankly into space, she had casually unzipped the side pocket of her carry-on bag, pulled out a standard legal envelope, and placed it squarely on his lap without a single word of warning. Griffin had looked down in utter bewilderment, tearing open the flap to pull out a formal, state-certified divorce petition filed quietly by her high-priced legal team 6 weeks prior, 4 weeks before she ever even suggested selling our family home on Delano Way. The petition cited irreconcilable differences, complete financial insolvency, and an immediate demand for sole separate maintenance, ensuring she would sever all remaining legal ties before his impending federal indictments fully cascaded onto her public record. Celine hadn't merely used him as a corporate tool. She had systematically engineered his entire downfall as a calculated hedge to protect her own skin, leaving him utterly penniless, legally abandoned, and emotionally eviscerated. The bus rumbled forward into the gray November rain, carrying two people who had believed they were destined to rule the corporate world, now reduced to broken wreckage discarded by the very machinery of greed they had so gleefully constructed. The grueling 32-hour Greyhound bus ride finally dragged to a miserable halt, and my son Griffin dragged his battered, exhausted frame back onto the soil of our family farm on a bitterly cold November morning. The heavy scent of diesel exhaust still clung to his expensive designer coat, which was now deeply wrinkled, stained, and completely ruined by days of travel among desperate strangers. He looked like a man who had not slept in days, not merely from the physical hardship of the road, but from the crushing, suffocating realization that he had completely run out of places to hide and run out of people to manipulate. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door of the farmhouse, with Celine trailing silently behind him, carrying her modest luggage, before she immediately turned around and walked away toward a waiting taxi, without a single backward glance, Griffin stepped into a kitchen that no longer belonged to his illusions. Sitting at the worn wooden table where every major family and business decision in the Lancaster history had been forged since 1986, the exact table where Eleanor and I had signed our first commercial loan, was Felix Kendrick. Felix sat there calmly, his reading glasses perched neatly on his nose, reviewing the upcoming month's trust distribution files on a sleek laptop, while the framed photograph of Felix standing proudly between Eleanor and me rested quietly right beside his coffee mug. I sat nearby in my worn leather armchair, holding my own warm mug of coffee, watching the scene unfold with total unshakable calm. I did not stand up to yell at him, I did not offer a single word of sarcastic vindication, and I did not waste my breath on petty insults. Felix is currently reviewing next month's infrastructure trust distribution documents, I said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. Griffin's bloodshot eyes darted wildly from me to Felix, then to the laptop screen, and finally locked onto the framed photograph he had walked past 3 separate times in 8 years without ever having the basic human decency to ask who the young man was. I watched the final brutal truth land upon his soul like a massive stone dropped into still water. "Sit down," I instructed softly, pointing toward the empty chair. "Both of you." Celine, who had lingered near the door waiting for her final exit, sat down mechanically. For the absolute first time since I had ever met her, she did not utter a single calculated word. Her eyes fixed blankly on the scarred wooden surface, her elaborate schemes completely neutralized by reality. Griffin remained standing rigidly for another 10 full seconds, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he frantically searched for the right angle, the right excuse, or the right manipulation to turn this catastrophe into something manageable. When he finally realized there were no angles left, he collapsed into a chair. "How many phone calls did you make before you bought those bus tickets?" I asked him gently, my voice steady and level. Griffin's jaw tightened into a hard knot, and he kept his eyes glued to the floor. 11, I answered for him, leaning forward slightly. "You desperately called 11 different business associates and high-ranking contacts." Felix tracked the institutional communications network. 9 of them did not even bother to answer your frantic calls. 1 picked up, listened for 5 seconds in absolute horror, and immediately hung up. And your closest corporate ally, the man who attended your birthday party just 2 years ago, stayed on the line only long enough to snap, "Griffin, I cannot be seen anywhere near your sinking ship. I literally just posted a LinkedIn tribute praising your father as a true Midwestern legend, so do not ever call this number again." Griffin's face turned ghostly pale. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, which had long since grown lukewarm. "You spent 15 years meticulously building those superficial connections, Griffin. 15 years of corporate dinners, networking cocktails, strategic partnerships, and carefully managed public relationships. Yet it took precisely 47 minutes at Gate 42 in Des Moines to completely erase every single one of them. Not because of anything I actively did, but because of what you chose to do when the world was finally watching. Let me teach you the absolute, defining difference between hollow connections and genuine character, because it is the only lesson truly worth learning from this entire wreckage. Connections are built entirely on what people falsely believe you can do for their own personal advancement. Character, however, is forged entirely by what you choose to do when absolutely no one is watching, and there is zero personal reward in it for you. You spent your life building hollow connections, Griffin. Felix spent his building unshakable character. Only one of those two things survives direct contact with the unvarnished truth. Griffin finally broke down, his voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic whisper. What do you want me to do now, Dad? Nothing, I replied calmly. There is nothing left to say that your mother didn't already articulate crystal clear in her video testament back in October. Celine slowly stood up from the table, her eyes calculating distances toward the door, preparing to make her final permanent escape. I'll wait out in the car, she murmured quietly, walking past Griffin without so much as a parting glance. Griffin did not stop her, did not look up, and did not try to negotiate. He simply stared blankly at the table. A 32-year-old man whose Manhattan life had been violently reduced to a single canvas bag and whatever loose change remained in a stranger's wallet. I looked down at my son, feeling a profound, heavy wave of paternal grief. Not anger, not triumph, but the deep, aching sorrow that only a father can experience when looking at a child who had chosen to destroy his own foundation rather than accept the quiet dignity of honest work. The following afternoon, before the cold Iowa sun dipped below the horizon, I drove alone out to the quiet cemetery where Eleanor's simple granite headstone stood proudly against the gray November sky. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the surrounding oak trees, carrying the faint, distant call of a crow from across the far pasture. I stepped slowly across the damp grass, knelt down beside her grave, and placed my open palm flat against the cold, unyielding stone. You were completely right about everything, Ellie, I whispered aloud into the quiet stillness of the Iowa afternoon, letting the emotion wash over me without holding anything back. Especially about Felix. He is carrying our legacy with the kind of grace and integrity you always hoped for. And as for our son, the bird has finally been cast back out into the fierce winter storm. I stayed there for 10 full minutes, my hand resting against the granite, feeling the enduring strength of her memory steadying my soul. I knew what had to be done next because true family justice does not end with mere retaliation. It ends with a return to the absolute truth. When I returned to the farmhouse later that evening, Griffin was sitting quietly on the porch steps, staring out over the dark agricultural fields. I walked over, did not say a word, and handed him a plain, unsealed manila envelope. With shaking, hesitant fingers, Griffin pulled out the contents, a single economy-class airline ticket bound for Juneau, Alaska, departing in 5 days, accompanied by a small slip of paper with a handwritten address scribbled in my own handwriting. The exact location of the rugged 1977 timber sawmill that was still actively hiring night shift workers who did not mind the freezing cold and did not expect corporate comfort. Griffin stared at the ticket for a long, agonizing moment, his breath hitching in his throat. I don't know if I have the strength to do this, Dad, he finally whispered, his voice trembling on the edge of tears. Neither did I, Griffin. Back when I first stepped off that bus at age 20, I replied steadily, looking him straight in the eye. That is precisely the point. Let me teach you what it truly means to start completely over from absolute zero, because most privileged people never learn it in a lifetime. It means discovering with absolute finality that human dignity is never something you can simply purchase with stolen money, inflated corporate titles, or corner office status. True dignity is something you carry entirely within yourself, manifested purely in how you treat the human being who can do absolutely nothing to advance your interests. I learned that harsh, beautiful lesson at age 20 in the sub-zero snowstorms of Alaska. Now, Griffin, you get the rare, invaluable opportunity to learn it at 32, if you possess the courage to survive it. Griffin did not offer a single word of argument. He simply gripped the airline ticket tightly in his hand, stood up slowly, and walked away down the gravel driveway toward the tree line, vanishing step by step into the gathering November twilight like a ghost walking back into reality. I stood on the porch and watched him disappear completely, offering no parting shouts, no waves, and no false promises. Just watching the way a wise man watches someone step onto a solitary mountain path that no one else can ever walk for them. When I turned around to step back inside the warm kitchen, Felix was standing quietly by the doorway, holding a fresh mug of hot coffee for me. He nodded once, a silent, profound understanding passing effortlessly between us without needing a single spoken syllable. That is the true, transcendent essence of people who have genuinely earned their place in this world. They intuitively know precisely when to speak, and when absolute silence is the most eloquent language available. I unbuttoned my worn canvas work coat, hung it carefully on the wall hook directly beside Eleanor's old faded jacket, knowing I would never take hers down, and realizing that perhaps I never should. I sat down at the heavy wooden table where every major decision of our family's existence had been made for decades. For the very first time since Eleanor first fell ill, there was not a single soul left on this earth whom I needed to protect from the inevitable consequences of their own choices. No ungrateful son to shield from reality, no fragile illusions to maintain, and no manufactured corporate empires to guard against greed. There was only profound, unbroken silence. That night at Gate 42 in Des Moines, when my son had finally looked directly at me and truly perceived me for the very first time in his 32 years, seeing not the poor, embarrassing father he had spent his life trying to escape, but the quiet architect who had built everything he ever took for granted, I did not feel the hollow rush of petty triumph or vindication. I merely felt completely, beautifully finished. The exact way a weary traveler feels when they have carried an impossibly heavy burden across a vast, unforgiving desert for so long that finally setting it down does not instantly make them feel lighter. It simply means they can finally stop walking, take a deep breath, and rest. And to you, my friend, as you listen to my story today, remember this above all else. True silence is never a sign of weakness, and enduring patience is never a form of surrender. Looking back across the decades, perhaps I should have spoken up much sooner. Perhaps being a wise father is not merely about silent endurance, but about actively teaching the unvarnished consequences of reality before it is too late. But I stayed silent too long, foolishly believing he would figure it out on his own. Do not make that same catastrophic mistake in your own home. Real family justice does not mean destroying someone you love. It means loving them fiercely enough to finally stop protecting them from the unforgiving truth of the world. I firmly believe that divine timing brings every hidden thing to light precisely when it needs to be revealed, not a single moment sooner, and not a single moment later. Sometimes the absolute hardest, most agonizing act of pure love a parent can ever execute is stepping completely backward, opening your clenched hands, and letting the unvarnished truth accomplish what your tired words could never achieve. If this story resonated somewhere deep inside your soul today, I would love to hear your personal thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been forced to make an agonizing, heartbreaking choice regarding family justice? Share this video with someone who might desperately need to hear these words tonight. And if you want to walk alongside more journeys like this, please subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback, a safe harbor for those rare souls who fully understand that being a steadfast father sometimes means loving someone enough to let them fall so they can finally learn how to stand. Thank you from the absolute bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end. Your precious time means infinitely more than mere words could ever express. Please always remember that while this story contains dramatized fictional elements woven in purely for reflection and learning, the underlying moral truth is what truly matters most. May it stay with you, anchor your spirit, and guide your steps long after the screen goes dark. Until next time, stay strong, keep your moral boundaries unyielding, and always, always take exceptionally good care of your heart.